Hi guys, welcome back to the Distinction Factory where we make our mark. And today we are going to be focusing on grade 10 function notation where we are comparing two graphs. This is a continuation of our previous video. So in this video, we have question 5 and it tells us that sketched below are the graphs of f of x is equal to ax squared plus q. That is a parabola, so it is referring to this graph here. And then we've got G, which is a straight line graph, and that is represented by this little guy over here. All right, they tell us that we need to figure out the x values for which f of x minus g of x is greater than 0. So what that basically means, I will show you guys an easier way, but what that means is they want to figure out where the y values of your parabola minus the y values of your straight line gives you a positive number. So that means you're doing your vertical line test, which you can find in our previous video, and you are comparing the y values and subtracting them from each other. And each time you subtract them, you must end up with a positive number, not a negative number. All right, but to make it a bit easier for us to tackle this question, what I would do is I would take this negative g of x across my inequality sign and it will become a positive g of x. So essentially we have f of x greater than g of x. All right, that makes it a bit easier because we've dealt with a question like this previously. F of x refers to the y values of our parabola. And those have to be higher than or greater than the y values of our straight line graph. So we know that we need to section the graphs off into their points of intersection because we are comparing them with each other. So the points of intersection of our graph is here at R and here at T. That's where both the graphs intercept with each other. So I will draw a line coming straight down to create my sections and another line coming straight down through T to create another section. So now I have three different sections, this first one, the middle one, and our last one. And we're going to do our vertical line test for our parabola being higher than the straight line. Remember, you can find a better explanation on the vertical line test in our previous video. So for the parabola, we have our y value down here, and then for the straight line graph, directly above this, we've got our y value there. And what we can see is that the y value of your straight line is actually higher than the y value of the parabola, which is not what we wanted. We wanted it the other way around. So this does not answer our question. So let's move on to the next section. In the next part, here is our parabola and here is our straight line. And if we can take any of the y coordinates, let's say I take this part here on our parabola, directly below that is this y value. And what we can see is that the y value of our parabola is actually higher than the y value of the straight line, which is what they wanted. So that means that this does answer our question. The same thing applies anywhere in that section. So even if I look here, there's my y value on my parabola, and directly below that is the y value of the straight line. And again, the parabola is higher than the straight line. So it does still answer the question. Now we can move on to the third section where we have our straight line here and our parabola down here. And if I have to take the y value at this point, directly below that gives us the y value on our parabola. And you'll notice that the y value of the straight line is higher than the y value of the parabola, which is not what they wanted. So this does not answer our question. We are only referring to the middle part of our graph. So we now have to get the x coordinates that relate to the points of intersection of those two graphs. And that means that we are referring to the x value of R and the x value of T. So we've got -2 and +2. So for 5.16, A's answer, we are going to tell them that x needs to lie in between the -2 and +2. Notice that we write it in this format because it's one continuous answer. It's one continuous section that we are pointing out to them. So we can write it in this way. In the next one, we'll be looking at when there's two different answers to our question. Alternatively, you could also write it as x element of -2 to +2. And we are using circle brackets because this is not including the values. All right, now we can go on to the next one. The next one wants us to determine where f of x times by g of x is negative. So let's understand what that means. F of x refers to the y values of the parabola, and that is being multiplied to g of x, which is the y values of the straight line graph. And whenever you multiply that, you need to end up with a negative answer. Now, if we have to think about this, we are multiplying two different numbers. The y value is here and the y value is here. And we need to end up with a negative. So there's an easy way for us to determine these values. Remember that if I multiply a positive and a negative together, I do end up with a negative answer. So that means that when the parabola is positive, meaning that it lies above the y-axis, or rather the x-axis, and we take those values and multiply it to where the straight line is negative. So when it's negative, remember that it means that it lies below the x-axis. Then we will end up with a positive answer. So we are looking for where the parabola is on the top while the straight line is at the bottom. Or alternatively, I could switch it around and I could make it where the parabola is negative and that's being multiplied to a positive straight line. Then I still end up with a negative answer. So this means that the parabola must be below the x-axis while the straight line is above the x-axis. So let us compare let us section off our graph to see where we are going to be doing our comparisons. We will section them off where they are meeting with the x-axis, so our x-intercepts, because we're going to check where they're above and below it. So our first x-intercept is here at x. Let me draw my line coming down to create my first section. And then we are looking at S, which is our next x-intercept. So I'll draw my next line coming down, cutting through S. All right, and now we can go through each of these sections and figure out where one is on the top while the other one's at the bottom. So in our first section, here's our straight line up here for positive y values. And then here's our parabola down here. And that's below the x-axis. So these have negative y values. These are positive while these are negative. And when I multiply a positive and a negative together, I do end up with a negative answer. So this does answer my question. Then if I go to the next section, I have my parabola over here and my straight line here. Now if I'm looking at my parabola, I have positive y values because it's above the x-axis. And if I'm looking at my straight line graph, which is this guy here, this is also above the x-axis, so that's also positive. But when I multiply two positives together, I end up with a positive answer, which is not what they wanted. So this does not answer my question. Even if I was looking at it with the vertical line test, I could be comparing this value up here with this value here. Again, a positive number and a positive number. And that gives me a positive. So that does not answer the question. Now we can go on to the third section of our graph. And here we are looking at our parabola down here and our straight line up here. So if we are looking at the straight line, we have positive y values. And directly below that, we've got our parabola. And this now has negative y values. So when we multiply this positive y with the negative y's, we end up with a negative answer, which is what they wanted. So this does answer my question. Now it leaves us to a matter of writing out our answer. This has two different sections to it. It is not one continuous section like what we had in our previous answer. Here we are specifying two sections, so we cannot put it as as a continuity like what we did up here. Instead, we will write them as two separate answers. So our x value for P, which was our x-intercept, was -4. So I'll say that x needs to be less than -4 and equal to, because they do want us to include it. Or x will have to be greater than +4 because that is the x value of S, and equal to +4. That is the one way that we can represent our answers. Alternatively, you could write it as x element of -infinity all the way up until -4, or x element of 4 up until +infinity. I will just change these to include the -4 and the +4 because they did specify that it has to be equal to each other. So it has to be including those values. I hope that helps you guys. You can join us in our next video to tackle our next question that we have on the screen. Thank you.